Hello, I'm Phil Gower from Phil Gower Bird Photography, and thanks for joining me on another video today. I've been racking my brains, now we're in national lockdown, to come up with some really interesting and compelling content, but I abandoned that idea and came up with this. So in this video I'll be sharing some of my favourite camera settings, some of my favourite birding locations and some of my favourite images of 2020. So let's get started. Excuse me, I better get that. It's disappointing news, I'm afraid. Apparently Viagra won't make you Daniel Craig in the bedroom, but it will make you Roger Moore. So that's the calibre of the people I go birding with. Blooming marvellous. Now I can't say I took too many images in 2020 because of the pandemic. That resulted in very few trips throughout the 12 months. But I did take some images, and really it all pales into insignificance when you think about the trauma and loss that so many people suffered in the last 12 months. But I did take some images, and before we take a look at them in some detail, let's talk camera settings. So in terms of photography, 2020 was really a significant year for me because that's the year I changed camera systems. I changed from Canon. I've been a Canon user really from the age of 18. Not bird photography because I only took that up about 7 years ago, but I've always been a Canon user. And up to that point I'd used the Canon 5DSR, which was my last camera. Fantastic camera, but it was coming to the end of its shelf life. And I really wanted a camera system that had better autofocus, hopefully a few more megapixels so I could crop a bit more, and also more frames per second, which was really important to me. So I settled on the Sony system, and this is the first camera I bought from Sony. So this is the A7R4, Sony A7R4, 61 megapixel camera, fantastic croppability, and with it I bought the 200, the FE200 to 600, which at its widest end was f5.6 to 6.3, so a really good combination. Now I remember I bought this on New Year's Day, in fact, 2020. I remember being really excited by this new camera. I got it home, took about an hour to drive home after I collected it. I unboxed it, and it was a nice sunny day. New Year's Day was a really lovely sunny day. I decided to drive to the Salisbury Plain to test it out. Salisbury Plain being about 45 minutes away, so I knew I'd have about an hour and a half once I got there, hour and a half of light to take some shots. So shoved it all in the car. I actually charged it on the way to the Salisbury Plain. I used the USB charger in the car. Now immediately I arrived on the plane, I spotted a short-eared owl. So out of the car, into the long grass, and just sat there waiting for it to come towards me. And come towards me it did. Now I didn't have a clue how to use this essentially. I did set it to manual mode, which is the mode I always use, but I didn't know what focus area to choose. Fortunately I was in focus area wide, and the owl flew past and I just snapped away. And this image you can see now, this is one of the first images I took on this camera, and it kind of bowled me over and I was hooked on Sony. So my next task over the next few months was to really get to grips with this new system, the menu system, all the functions and features that this camera has to offer. I wasn't alone in that, I had some help. Don Donning, who's one of my friends on Flickr, and his wife Sonia, they pointed me in the direction of two really excellent YouTubers. One was Mark Gaylor, who's a Sony ambassador. The other one was Mark Smith, who's a really good bird photographer in the States. So I'd sort of advise you, if you wanted to find out about the Sony, certainly look up Mark Gaylor, and I'll leave a link below. He's got a great website, superb resources, and Mark is really a bit of a technician. He kind of knows the ins and outs of the system, and well worth a watch. Mark Smith, on the other hand, is a really good bird photographer. I'm not sure that Mark Gellies probably is, but Mark Smith is a superb bird photographer, and he looks at the system from the bird photographer point of view. He's got some excellent images and gives you some really excellent advice. So I'll leave a link to Mark Smith as well in the description below. So I've learned plenty about this system over the last 12 months, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. I'm going to share with you the settings I use, my favourite settings for birds in flight photography. Now the caveat with that, of course, is that I love those settings and they're great for me, but there's more than one way to take great bird images. So let's take a look at my settings. Okay, so let's start with shooting mode, and I exclusively shoot manual mode with auto ISO. To set this up, turn the shooting mode dial to M for manual, and select auto ISO in the ISO menu using the quick button or using the main menu. So now that's set, I'll explain why this shooting mode is right for me. So with manual mode and auto ISO, you get to select the aperture and you get to select the shutter speed. And obviously they're two really vital components in flight photography. But indirectly you get to control the ISO as well, and that's done through the aperture and shutter speed you select. I use the front dial just below the shutter release to control the shutter speed, and the back dial at the top to control aperture. The camera sets the ISO accordingly. The function of these two dials can be reversed in the menu. As you know, the aperture controls the size of the opening in the lens. The smaller the F number, the larger the opening. Now often for birds in flight I need to use the largest, widest aperture, for example f4 on my 600mm. Because shooting at high speeds that you need for flight photography, you need as much light coming through the aperture to the sensor as possible. Also importantly, aperture controls the depth of field, and the widest aperture of a lens provides the shallowest depth of field. So if I manage to focus on a bird's eye, it might be that the body and the tail appear out of focus because the depth of field is so shallow. Also, the distance to the subject also has a bearing on the depth of field. The further away the subject, the greater the depth of field. Typically I shoot between f4 on my 600 and f8. Now f4 is a wide aperture, which is great for background blur and bokeh, whereas f8 is slightly wider depth of field, and it enables me to get more in focus. Shutter speed is also really important in flight photography. Now while camera shake is rarely a problem due to the high shutter speeds you use, in flight photography you do have to grapple with motion blur. Different birds fly at different speeds, and to freeze the action you need fast enough shutter speeds. Most of my flight shots are shot between 1/1250th and 1/2500th, but I may need to shoot faster if the bird is particularly fast or flying close. The closer the action is, the faster the shutter speed required. In a while I'll be showing you my favourite flight shots of 2020, and I'll also give you the settings for each image, and hopefully this will help. So in manual mode with auto ISO, I have all the control I need to take what I hope will be perfect flight shots. But probably just a quick word on ISO. Manually selecting the perfect aperture and the perfect shutter speed for each shot is fantastic, but I also need to keep an eye on ISO when it's selected by the camera. Often ISO becomes very high and images too grainy. So I may have to give up some depth of field or some shutter speed to bring the ISO into an acceptable setting. With the Sony system, my preference is to keep ISO as low as possible and hopefully below 800. That said, with modern noise reduction software, you can achieve great results with very high ISO settings. So I will stomach high ISO settings if I have the right aperture and shutter speed for the shot in front of me. So just a quick word on image stabilization. Now I know some say turn off image stabilization for flight photography because it's not needed with such high shutter speeds, but I still find it a great help when acquiring a bird in the frame, and it has no detrimental impact on the quality of the image, so I keep it on. And the mode I use is mode 1. I will look at this in more detail in the future, and You know, when I find anything different, I will report back in another video. All I say for now is that all my favourite flight images for 2020 were shot with stabilisation on. So what about exposure compensation? Now, if you let the camera select ISO, a perfect exposure will not necessarily result every time. For example, a white bird, like a little egret, against a dark background is likely to be overexposed if you rely on the camera to choose ISO. And a dark bird against a bright sky is likely to be underexposed. So in these instances, you need to dial in some exposure compensation. Now, the beauty of mirrorless cameras over DSLRs is that you can see these exposure issues real time through the EVF. So in these instances, it's easiest to dial in some exposure compensation, 1/3 of a stop for each click. Now, to avoid taking my eye away from the viewfinder and ensure I move the compensation dial in the right direction, I just remember right is bright. Moving the dial to the right, anti-clockwise, makes the image and subject brighter, and moving the dial to the left clockwise makes the image and subject darker. Now, drive mode is very simple for birds in flight photography. You're going to need continuous shooting with the highest frame rate the camera will provide. To enter the drive mode, enter the menu system, navigate to tab 1, we're already on tab 1, we want to be on page 3, and drive mode's at the top. Enter that system, and we're already on continuous shooting high, enter that, and we're good to go. Now, I shoot as many frames as possible, and hopefully one will have a perfect wing position. And I'll be covering technique and the composition for flight photography in a future video. I use continuous focus 100% of the time for birds in flight photography, and most of the time for perch birds also. To enter the focus mode, click the menu button, get into the menu system. We navigate to tab 1, we're already there. We want page 5, navigate to page 5, and at the top you've got focus mode. Enter that system, and we're already in continuous AF, because I use that all the time. Out of the system, and we're ready to go. And while on the subject of focus, let's talk about back button focus. Now, I use back button focus all the time. I like the way it separates focusing from shutter release and exposure metering. Now, as I shoot continuous focus all the time, if focus was tied to the shutter release, I can never turn off the focus when taking a shot. Unless, of course, I used a dedicated focus hold button, which for me would confuse things. There are times you do need to hold focus when you take a shot. For example, you've got a perch bird, it starts spreading its wings. You want to focus on the bird's eye, but the wings keep interfering with the line of sight. With continuous focus, the result would be focusing on the wing potentially. So this would be a really great time to have a quick and simple way of holding focus on the eye. By moving focus to back button, I can focus when I want and hold focus when I want, just by releasing the button. Now, to set this up, you'll need to turn autofocus with shutter off. To set back button focus up, we need to deactivate autofocus with shutter. To do that, we go into the menu system. We make sure we're on tab 1, camera 1. We navigate to page 6. So I'm already on page 6 there. And down the bottom, you've got AF with shutter. Enter that, and we either turn it on or off, and we need it off. And that will separate the focus from shutter release. All that remains to do now is set up a button on the back we're going to use to autofocus. And we're going to use the AF on button just here. The way we do that is we need to back into menu system. We need to navigate to camera 2, so tab 2, and scroll through right to the back end. There it is on page 9. Enter custom key. So the button we need to assign is button 3, and we need to assign AF on to that button. It's already on AF on because that's what I use, so just make sure that's AF on. There are 27 pages you could scroll through, so you can customize that button in many different ways, but we need AF on, so I'll just press that, and we're now good to go. I'll get out of the system. So top button will activate exposure metering. If I press it further, it will press the shutter, and AF on activates the focus system. So focus system held on, and I take the shot with the shutter release. So the process now is to use the back button to focus and press the shutter release to take the shot. It might take a while to get used to, but it's well worth the effort. Back button focus means that you have greater control over when you focus, but it also comes with a few other advantages when selecting focus areas, for example, and I'll cover that off in a while. Now, Sony provides 14 focus areas to choose from, and I only need access to 4 of them, and these cover my birds in flight and perch birds needs. So the first thing we need to do is limit the areas we have access to. I limit these to 4. There's only 4 focus areas I use, and the way we do that is we need to access the menu. We need to make sure we're in tab 1 and navigate to page 5, and at the bottom here you can see focus area limit. So we enter that system. There are 14 focus areas available. At the top we've got the standard, so we've got wide, zone, center, flexible spot small, flexible spot medium, flexible spot large, and expand flexible spot. Of those I just want to use 4. I use wide, zone, flexible spot small, and expand flexible spot rather. At the bottom on the second tier we've got all the tracking modes. They're essentially the same as the 7 above, but with tracking assigned to them. So I don't use tracking at the moment. I prefer to track the subject in the viewfinder, and I hear from other Sony users that while Sony has animal eye detect tracking, it's not 100% reliable for birds. So I'm just going to give that a miss for now until Sony improves that function. So what I do though is I select the 4 I've got here: expand flexible spot, I've got flexible spot small, and I've got zone, and I've got wide. So just make sure if you want to select those that you go down to the OK button and select OK. And those now have been set as my only 4 options for selection in terms of focus areas. What we now need to do is assign a button so that we can toggle those and use them. The button I'm going to assign is the C2 button. So let's look at that. So to assign the C2 button, we've got to go back into the menu system. We've got to navigate to tab 2, and we've got to go to page 9, which is the custom key. There's the custom key. We go into the custom key, and the key I would like to assign is on the top. It's number 2 there, and I'm going to assign that to switch focus. Now it's already assigned to that because that's how I use it, but you just go into that system and you've got 27 pages of functions you can assign to that button. But I'm going to assign switch focus area, so that's assigned. That's okay. What I can do now is come out of the menu, and you'll find that that is all been assigned. So now I have 4 focus areas to select, and the way I toggle those is with this C2 button, which is at the top. So I'll do that now. So I'm in zone at the moment. I can move into flexible spot with one push of the button. I can then move into expand flexible spot, or come back round to wide, which is my first selection. Okay, so I spend most of my time in zone, and really I tend to toggle between zone and flexible spot. So zone for birds in flight, and flexible spot small for perch birds, and it's as simple as that. So let's take a look at the focus areas I use and why. So first of all, let's go into wide. That's the wide focus area. This uses all 567 focus points. And when I activate it with the back button, Essentially, if the bird's anywhere in that focus area, as long as there's no obstructions in front of the bird and the bird is the nearest point to the camera, it's going to focus on the bird. So really good in lots of situations. The problem with it though is that quite often, you know, birds are flying through cluttered areas. In that instance, I'd use the zone focus area. So this is zone. As you can see, the focus area is shrunk down, so that means you get a more precise focus on the bird. It's actually picking up the bird's face at the moment on the bird. So should there be grasses in front of this bird, hopefully the focus area is above that and focus on the bird. So I find that far more useful, and I use that pretty much, you know, for birds in flight, probably 90% of the time. So it's a really good focus area for me. Okay, the next one, we got a single spot. So again, I'll activate that. You can move the single spot around. So let's put it on the owl's face. So this is really for perched birds. So you can get on the eye, move the focus point around, get on the eye, and it's very accurate. But clearly it helps if the subject's not moving. So that's a flexible single spot. And lastly, you've got this expand flexible spot, and that gives me the flexible single spot, but the spots around it as well. And that for me is ideal for birds like the barn owl, for example, that fly fairly slowly. And if I can get that focus area right on the face, I'm going to get a top shot every time. But not great for fast moving birds. Hand-eye coordination's not quite that good. But so they're the 4 areas I use, focus areas I use, and pretty much got me the results I got, you know, in 2020, which I'll be showing you in a minute. There are 2 other advantages of back button focus I'll cover now. Another great feature with Sony is that you can register another focus area to another back button, which gives you instant access to 2 focus areas using back buttons. You do that by, first of all, you need to assign which button you're going to assign a focus area to. So let's activate the camera. So we go menu, we want to be in tab 2, and we navigate to page 9. We go back into custom key, and I want to assign the AEL button, So let's go in there. The AEL button is number 2. So I'm going to register AF area AF on. So that's what I've got it assigned to already, but if it was assigned to something else, I'll just have to come in here and assign reg AF area AF on. So that now has activated the AEL button to initiate focus, but on a second focus area of my selection. But I've now got to go back out and program that. So the way we do that is fairly straightforward. So we're back in the menu system, we go into tab 1, we need to be on page 7. And there it is, we go AF area registration, get onto that and turn it on. It's already on because I already use it. And now all we simply have to do is go to one of the 4 areas that I use. So let's say I want the second button to be assigned to flexible spot, small. So all I do, it's now in that mode, flexible spot. I just hold the function key until it registered the focus area. So what that means now is that on AF on, I've got the focus area that I've selected. So there you go, I've got zone. So that button's zone, and I can toggle forward that button. And this button on the right, the AEL, which I'm pressing now, that gives me the flexible spot small in the middle. So actually really, really flexible. I've now got instant access to the zone for birds in flight with the AF on button, it's back button, and then if I have a perched bird in front of me, I can just move to the AEL button and get flexible spot and get straight on that bird. So it's really practical and really efficient in the field. So there you have it. I'll never have to take my eye away from the viewfinder again. One other feature and function I don't think any other YouTuber has mentioned is the ability to program tracking on to a button. Now I've assigned this feature to the multi-selector center button, which is this one just here, the one that moves the focus spot around. So I press that and that activates tracking. So what I can do now, quite interestingly, is that let me just put it in, let's say, well, it's in zone at the moment, so I activate zone, By then moving my thumb over the multi-function button, I can actually also turn tracking on in zone. So now I've got the best of both worlds. I can implement zonal focus area and then track the bird if I really wanted to. Never used it yet, but I will use it and I'll report back in a future video. So there are 3 other settings I'd like to tell you about that have a bearing on flight photography, but I won't cover them in any great detail, just to tell you what settings I use. One is tracking sensitivity. So turn the menu on, you need to be in so tab 1, and we need to navigate to page 6, and here we've got AF tracking sensitivity. If I go into there, I keep it locked on, and what that means is if there's a cluttered area, let's say, and the bird flies behind a tree, and when it comes out the other end, I'll still be locked onto the bird. So I find that really useful. Other people might use responsive, for example, if you've got like swallows darting about your viewfinder, then that might be a good option, but I tend to use and keep it on locked on for the moment. So that's that one. And the next one is the use of the mechanical shutter. So again, I navigate to tab 2, and it's page 5, I believe. Page 5, and there's silent shooting. So silent shooting's on at the moment, and that's a silent shutter. That's 20 frames per second, but I don't use that because I don't want to get rolling shutter in my pictures. So I turn that off, and that automatically assigns me to mechanical shutter at 10 frames per second. There are quick buttons to do these things, of course. So I've got the trash can, I think, does that for me. But I'm just showing you the via the menu route. Okay, right. Let's turn that off, and it's off. So I've got mechanical shutter selected. And finally, shutter release priority. Let's go back into the menu. That's on tab 1. It's page 5, and the priority I set for continuous, because that's the AF shooting mode I use all the time, AF continuous, and I'll go into that, and essentially you've got, so what's the priority? Does the shutter release after you've acquired autofocus? Then that's what I want, because I want all my flight shots to be in focus. Do you just want the priority to be release, i.e. the shutter will fire as soon as you press it, even if the picture's not in focus or the bird's not in focus, or do you want that to be balanced between the two? But I choose AF as the priority. I really want my shots to be in focus. I have found that if you start a sequence out of focus, it's really quite difficult to get the sequence back in focus, so that's why I've set it to AF, and it works really well for me. Okay, that's that. So that's my favourite birds in flight settings. Sorry it was a little bit long-winded. As I said, in another video I'll take a look at birds in flight technique and composition. All that remains is to show you my favourite birds in flight shots for 2020. If you like what you see and would like to see more, then please like and subscribe to my channel before you leave. Bye for now.